Έχουμε τον Ματ Dryhurst. Είναι μουσικός, κυκλοφορεί μουσική, έρευνες. Αρκετοί τον ακολουθούν και στο Twitter, από ό,τι μιλάγαμε πριν. Θα μας μιλήσει για ένα θέμα γύρω από τον πολιτισμό που μας ενδιαφέρει και για την Αθήνα.
Hello. Thanks for sticking around. So yeah, just like to start by saying I'm pretty much in agreement with everyone who came before. I think maybe the one takeaway is that protocol is a very flexible word that can refer to both a technical system and an ethical system. And so when I'm going to use the word protocol interchangeably in this presentation. What I'm looking to do, in a sense, is first address the framing of this discussion for the event, talk about a few speculative things I've been thinking about, and end with proposition. I might skip through some slides. This gets a bit psychedelic at times, but yeah, bear with me. So the first part, this is curated under the title of Blockchain Utopia or U-turn. A U-turn to me suggests that we might be going backwards from something that we'd like to move towards. And so my contestation on that would be that I don't like where we're going. So the idea of a U-turn as some kind of a negative association doesn't work from my particular reading of where we are at the moment. So yeah, things are going to get worse. I also should qualify. I'm talking about this very much in the context of music, but I think music is often prophetic of greater societal shifts that happen with file sharing and so on and so forth. There's a reason that it's called the gig economy. So when I talk about music specifically, you can extrapolate that to your field of choice. But yeah, I wrote something quite a little kind of dystopian, which is unusual for me if you know me, recently for a different lecture. I'm just going to read a little bit of this because I feel like I put it better here than I'd be able to recount. So even music, you have a scenario where the platform monopolies that extend to social media companies, but in music more specifically, a platform such as Spotify shows no signs of slowing down their race toward totalizing monopoly. And the surveillance capitalist networks, if you like to use that term, basically networks that encourage everybody under the false kind of utopian narrative of accessibility and free access to everything, encourage everybody to share all of their thoughts and ideas with the world. And of course, in this new economic landscape that we live in, there are only a minority of people who can accurately read and purpose that data toward fruitful economic ends. So anyway, I'll read this. In opposition to that, there are a few kind of cutesy, what I would describe as U-turns, kind of longings for a Web 1 that appear and are often fashionable in technical communities. And similarly, within musical communities, kind of localist niche models are wonderful in idea, but insufficient so long as they are competitive with the platform monopolies. So basically, if you're set up to play the same game as them, you'll be trampled. And I've tried more than most to test this assumption for reasons I won't go into, but I've moved on in my thinking. So there will not be a streaming competitor to Spotify or whoever might acquire them. And our best bet is to drastically reconsider the value proposition of music. So what do people value and what are they prepared to support? Similarly, in relation to Spotify, and I think this extends also to YouTube, one of the more pernicious characterizations of the era that we live in is one of a consumer-focused kind of algorithmic populism, which again, under what I would say is the false utopian kind of rubric of accessibility, lures people in with the promise of cheap content, and ultimately, to me, kind of impoverishes the cultural landscape and our abilities to coordinate or move forward with more interesting propositions. Yeah, this is a slide for poptimism. If you're familiar with the musical conversation, I think I characterized. I should probably move past this slide, but characterized poptimism as basically the kind of the bargaining stage of grief, as we begin to understand our positions as kind of feudal content providers for monarchic pop star CEOs who hoover up ideas from the margins and convert them to profit. Yeah, and so another idea that, in a sense, has kind of won is this idea of independence, which, again, if you have any familiarity with musical history, is often considered a very positive thing. And I've started to begin to see it as, in fact, quite a negative thing. Another kind of false kind of Pyrrhic victory. Because, of course, now everyone is independent. The logic of independent music, the punks and the skateboarders, won. And it won and was manifest through Silicon Valley as this great kind of emancipatory force. And now everybody is independent to go and sell your wares or your body on the street with applications, whichever application you choose to download. And of course, what we learn over time and what we will begin to see in the coming decade is that when everyone is independent, when everybody is rendered a kind of mercenary selling whatever they have to offer under platform capitalism, they're not going to be too happy. I don't envy the Deliveroo driver as much as I might feel solidarity for them. So yeah, so in the context of blockchain and a U-turn or some kind of negative perspective on that, some ideas just won't die. There's a lot. I won't even bring many kind of blockchain music-related projects. I don't want to bring them up because, to be honest, I haven't seen that much new. Maybe I'm difficult to please. But so, for example, one thing that persists in the blockchain space, which is related, of course, to stuff Ruth was referencing with attribution, is this idea of DRM, or digital rights management. And so if you think that's bad now, the takedown requests that might appear on different platforms, imagine if your entire browsing history was immutably preserved on a blockchain somewhere for the lawyers to crawl and hunt you down for the $50 or whatever for the Katy Perry record you just listened to. So that's a bad idea that we don't want to continue in this space. Similarly, and now this is where Matt and I might disagree, we agree on a lot of things, the idea of a TCR. Now, a TCR, or a token curated registry, is actually a very, very useful, I'll give you like a 20-second breakthrough. Imagine Wikipedia. Wikipedia, you have a voluntary kind of force editing and kind of pruning and keeping it the information on there presentable and accurate. Imagine throwing a token into that equation. So you're basically finding ways to incentivize people to get paid to keep clean books or whatnot. That idea, I think, is all well and good in terms of maintaining the kind of the cleanliness of a database. But these ideas in the musical context often bleed into the kind of algorithmic populist logic that I would fight to the death that characterizes a Spotify. This idea that everybody in the world who owns a token can stake that token to, determine what the best song in the world is. I don't think any of us want to listen to whatever art is produced under that rubric. So, token curated registry is very interesting on a bureaucratic level, but on a cultural level, I'm very resistant to them, and that's an idea that I think, is worth. And also this idea of a one-size-fits-all model, which is another kind of hangover from Web 2, this idea of totalizing monopolies that can somehow equally compensate or equally deal with the various diverse communities that they force ultimately to work within their system. I think that is also an outdated model, and so there's a number of different and a barbaric logic, as I put here. I don't like Spotify very much, but I think that's also an idea that can be jettisoned and is a great shame, because ultimately, the great promise in my mind of the decentralized or the crypto space, I don't really care too much if a blockchain is involved, but the great promise of decentralized spaces is the idea that there might be multiple competing systems that, we could see one thrive in Athens and three thrive in Milan, and we could all learn from each other. So the idea of one single totalizing logic to structure the future of music, to me, is absurd and a great missed opportunity. Sadly, in the race, as I believe Ruth put it earlier, in the race to kind of be the protocol, most cannot help but put forward a totalizing vision of complete protocol dominance. And so that's why I tend to be quite disinterested in many of them. Anyway, so I titled this, with these talks you always kind of have to write the title before you write the thing. So using the undead metaphor of the idea of these ideas that just kind of won't go away. We have all this new tech, there's all this new money in this tech, and yet somehow these little memes persist from an era of the web that I would rather move on from. How do you deal with the undead? You stake it in the heart, as Buffy made a name for herself doing. And of course, the great opportunity here, as has been mentioned by everyone on the stage tonight, is the idea of a utopian protocol. Protocol, again, just meaning what the fuck do we want to do? So this opportunity to basically reconsider with a new stack, with a new suite of tools, what we would like to do with ourselves as a community of 10 or a community of 10,000 is a huge opportunity. So stake, this is where it gets artsy, but stake's a cool word for me and for my purposes and analogies, right? Because at the beginning I said it's a high stakes because I don't think we can go back, and I don't think that we can actually afford, or at least those of us on the cultural margins can afford to continue on this path. A stake in a project, because through tokenization and some of these ideas, you can distribute ownership, which I think is a huge, huge innovation. The ability to quickly and cheaply distribute ownership under models that Matt had discussed earlier. And of course, align incentives by giving kind of a shared stake in something. A stake in the ground is also a support structure. You plant vines and trees on stakes, and it demarks new territory. That analogy would be particularly useful with where I end this. And of course, it's a stake in the heart of undead cultural ideas that just need to go away. So first off, on the utopian mindset, hat tip to the crypto rave happening tonight. But yeah, utopian, uncompetitive idea, so an idea that is not mirroring or mimicking where we are at currently. How about we not allow our scenes to serve as free research and design for surveillance networks and their patrons? How about we just leave that? That is possible through new networks, and I think it's kind of a cool idea. Similarly, how about we jettison the logic of DRM or the concept of independent music and instead think about interdependent attribution networks, a stake in the heart of the individualist mythos. So attribution networks all of a sudden afford us the possibility to get rid of this idea that there is a lone genius atop culture, which of course anybody who works in the culture industry knows is bullshit, and instead acknowledge the number of people, the work that is often put into cultural works. And of course, this is a huge problem because not acknowledging this has also allowed, I believe, the platform monopolies such as Spotify to move in and kind of disregard the roles of the numerous individuals that, for example, were behind putting a record out. So when you see the Spotify CEO will come forward and talk about 1 million artists being able to make a living off his platform in 10 or 15 years or whatever the time horizon is, his vision ultimately is a bunch of people isolated in their bedroom making piano music for you to shower to, which of course is, again, a very impoverished vision of culture. And I think we make culture richer through attributing the work that has gone into a product. Similarly, interdependent equity networks versus independent mercenary networks. So I would characterize a Spotify or a YouTube or a Twitter in which it's kind of winner takes all, dog eat dog kind of incentive environments. The idea of tokenization and the idea of equity, I think, is a really interesting idea to explore beyond that. So spread the wealth internally and give people a stake in their scene. And similarly, on top, and this again, Matt referenced something quite complimentary earlier, but the idea of DAO or guild protocol markets, to the person, I believe someone who gave a question earlier talking about economic incentive models, at least in my vision of where these things go, and as has kind of played out in the crypto sphere generally with kind of forking mechanisms, the ability to hard fork over disagreements, I don't see this as putting forward kind of one totalizing vision, but instead inviting people to state their objectives, populate that territory, and argue over the future of that particular protocol or that particular scene. And the many forks and disagreements that come from that, I would encourage. I wish there was more debate about such things. So yeah, so this is a vending machine called Protocol, and it's cool. Yeah, I was supposed to say something about that. Oh yeah, so again, just reiterating the idea of protocol of basically saying, like, what are the affordances of a system, how do things work, and how ought they work? One example of this in a specific music context that I've been looking at recently, and I've tried to be relatively kind of impartial about this, is the idea of DJing. What is the protocol of DJing saying, irrespective of its very storied history? The protocol of DJing says, I want to be free to earn money, curating and performing the work I discover in the world, and not be held responsible to accredit or compensate the creator. Right? That is basically the protocol of DJing, which also happens to be very, very complementary to the curator market protocols of Web 2, and also, I could talk about this for hours, is kind of very complementary to Tim Berners-Lee's original vision of the web, in contrast to other ideas such as Ted Nelson's model of the web, which was built with attribution at its core. The idea of DJing or curation or freedom of information, the great hacker ethic of freedom of information, is very complementary to the DJ thing of saying, I am a special person who witnessed this special thing happening. I am free to take it and profit from it at will. So that's an example of a protocol. So I've got 15 minutes left. One thing I think is quite, in my personal thinking, beyond kind of shitting on DJs, many of my friends are DJs, is to think about physical space. Fortunately, every presentation thus far has been talking about DAOs. I'm also kind of a fan and very intrigued about DAOs, so I don't need to explain what that is yet. But one observation I've made through working in music for such a long time, I remember 2 years ago being in Berlin, and this is a squat called the Kopi, which has been around for a really long time. I was at the Kopi seeing a friend perform a show. It was like a grindcore night. And I was looking around me, and everybody in the vicinity was dressed as if it was 1986, with their punk t-shirts and grind t-shirts. I've noticed quite a few in this city. And then an hour later, I went to a Tonal festival across the road, happening at Trésor, in which a bunch of people pretty much exclusively wearing black and industrial music t-shirts looked as if they were in 1991. And it made me reflect and meditate on the idea that ultimately those who own space dictate the future of subcultures. And that is part of the reason why, as much as the storied and wonderful history of techno in Berlin is a wonderful chapter in history, it's a little strange to me that it is still the dominant narrative, being a 50-year-old subculture. But of course, people own the space. And if you program the space, you kind of program how people go out. So I've been thinking a bit more about DAOs and saying, okay, well, so you have this club culture that's existed in kind of the 20th century. How about we go a little bit further back? And one of the really interesting things, I'm framing this with Berlin just because the analogy is quite easy because people know of it with regards to clubs, is this idea of the Automat, or of an automated building. And so the first of its kind was this Quisisana from 1897, was developed in Berlin as an automated restaurant. So basically a vending machine restaurant. And vending machines, for those who don't know, is kind of the most easy lay analogy that's used to describe smart contract systems. You put something in, something comes out predetermined. That can get very complex or be very simple. Similarly, the Metropole, which was kind of the Berghain of the 70s and 80s, kind of the epicenter of musical culture in West Berlin, also intrigued me as having a number of different systems that we might be able to learn from going forward. So for example, the Metropole had their own internal charting systems. So they had internal markets to the clubs attempting to stimulate commerce around records released in the club. And they also issued their own token, which I actually am waiting to hear more about this. I've confirmed that this is true, but I'm speculating as to how the token was used because sadly the only person still alive who knows about it is a 70-something-year-old who is not on social networks. The Metropole was also, I think, wonderfully the site for an Italian horror film in the 80s, Lamberto Bava's Demoni. It was co-produced by Dario Argento, for those who might know who he is. It's kind of this wonderful story of the undead spawning from a theater screen. And I don't have the image of this, but the young clubbers then proceed to stab in the heart a bunch of undead people in order to liberate the club from a demonic haunting, which I think is a wonderful analogy for what I'm about to propose. Similarly, in Berlin, through the 2000s, there was Bar Automaten in Mitte, which I actually attended one time. Similar idea. It was a vending machine bar with a jukebox that was never empty. So specifically, this is pivoting a little bit. In Berlin at the moment, there is a real estate blockchain company called BrickBlock who are currently trying to petition the European Parliament to allow for the legality of traded tokenized assets to be recognized by courts. There's a few different companies who are attempting to do this, but BrickBlock is attempting to do it specifically for real estate. I think in Athens, this is also a good heads up for you guys, because I know that you're already having a little bit of difficulty with the foreign investment coming in for property. But imagine in 10 years when an entire street in China can own 1% of an entire street in Athens through tokenized fractional ownership. This is something that people have a very serious intention of working out and is a very real scenario. Of course, that is a dystopian scenario. A utopian scenario is the idea of being able to say, what if we could all go in on a building together and the investments necessary to do that could be, as low as €1 to €1 million. Tokenized assets allow for this possibility. This is, the Oracle of Delphi. I don't need to talk. This is the awkward Greek analogy. But the question is, so going back to the earlier question, what do we stand for and what are we willing to invest in? On a really pragmatic level, people are still willing to invest in live music. People are still willing to invest in live experience. And I also wonder what might happen if the value proposition to an audience was to say, rather than buying a piece of vinyl that burns carbon traveling across the earth, literally is a big piece of oil, would you rather support a space and have a stake in that space and allow for the continuation of scenes that are dear to you? So questions come to mind. Can a club come to own itself with every beer and ticket sold? Profit splits could acquire the location, compensate labor, and create token holders. So create kind of stewards or guard dogs of the club. Can a club compensate artists automatically? This is something I've been working on and I'm kind of beating the drum about specifically in DJ world. But automated Oracle-based systems make this far more feasible, I would argue. Can it be governed by an international crew of members? So the idea of bridging transient, probably not dissimilar to what Ruth has been working on actually. The idea of bridging these kind of transient digital communities that are given an abundance of cheap free space online, giving them some root in the world and some governance mechanism to allow for that circulation. It's kind of a great kind of internationalist gesture. What might it mean to program a space differently for each usage? So the user experience of clubbing ought not to be one size fits all, and it is really quite strange that given all the things that have happened, going out really hasn't changed that much in the last 100 years. It's pretty much a sound system and a drink. So would a club enacting its own immutable protocol outcompete others? Equitable protocols might live up to the overblown narratives of a unified electronic music culture and community. Is it a kind of value add for an audience person that a protocol that is fully legible, as people before have mentioned, is made available, that it's quite clear where your money is going when you support culture? And what other experiments can we hold in real life to better reflect the visionary proposals occurring online? And in a DAO, so we talked about this earlier, an oracle. So an oracle is often the kind of component of the DAO that is manifesting the will of the code that has been written. It enacts a hard-coded ideology. A DAO or a guild manifest in physical space, or a guild hall, like the great guild halls of yore, might serve as a raving oracle for culture at large, like Pythia? That's my crowd pleaser. So Pythia, of course, who was induced into trance-like states to divine the future as the oracle of Delphi. So yeah, of course, there are precedents to this. There were actually great utopian experiments in club design that have instructed a lot of the clubs that you or I might have frequented. So this is a group called Grupo 999 and Super Studio, who built a space called Space Electronique. There's a number of others where they were basically trying to reconsider the club as an actual utopian space for a reconfiguration of how we interact with each other. I don't need to extend that analogy much further. That's a picture of a building called an oracle. And that's a guild hall. Yeah, so we've got 5 minutes for questions. Thank you very much for having me.